Hey guys, welcome to the respiratory system video. Today we're going to talk about why we breathe, how we breathe. We're going to talk about some lung volumes, which are very important for physicians, and talk about two different types of lung disease. So we're going to start off with talking about why do we breathe in the first place. The reason we breathe is because we need oxygen, of course. You guys probably know that. But why do we need that oxygen? Many of you have learned about cell respiration in your biology classes, maybe freshman year. So if you can reach back and remember that, cell respiration is important for our body to make ATP, which is energy, and we need oxygen as part of that reaction to get the ATP. So without oxygen, without breathing, our cells wouldn't have the recipe that they need in order to make energy for our cells to actually do the things that we need them to do. So then we can move to how do we breathe? Just a review of anatomy here. We've got air coming in through the mouth or the nose, going past the pharynx, and then it could go one of two ways. It can go into your digestive system or into your respiratory system. In this case, we want that air to go into the respiratory system, so it goes into the larynx, and then down the trachea into the bronchial tubes, which take us right into the lungs here. So that air gets into the lungs from the bronchial tubes, and then to these little branches here. You can see it looks like a huge tree of little branches. Each of those branches is a bronchiole. So these bronchioles, at the very end, they have these air-filled sacs called alveoli. And these alveoli, as you can see on the picture, have a lot of blood vessels surrounding them, kind of covering the alveoli. And so it's important to remember that inside the lungs, all of our lung tissue is made up of these bronchioles branching off with the air-filled sacs, the alveoli, and then the blood vessels around the alveoli are where we're able to absorb those gases, like the oxygen that we get from the air we breathe, into the bloodstream. So we need those blood vessels there to get that oxygen from our lungs. And I'm zoomed in here on the blood vessels around one single alveolus. So one of those air-filled sacs. And when that blood comes from the heart to the lungs, it doesn't have oxygen, so that's why it's blue here. It gets oxygen at the alveolus, where it turns red, and this alveolus, of course, is filled with the air that we breathed, filled with oxygen, so it got absorbed into the blood at this point, and that blood is taken back to the heart via the pulmonary veins, and then the heart can pump the blood with oxygen out to the rest of our body. How the gases are measured in our blood is something called partial pressure. So this will be important for you guys to know. If you ever hear partial pressure of a gas, that just means basically how much of it is there in the blood. For example, we can see here partial pressure is the capital P. Lowercase a, we're referring to the arteries coming from the heart. Capital A, we're talking about the blood near the alveolus itself. And then V is veins going back to the heart. So the partial pressure of the lowercase a, which would be the arteries coming from the heart, of oxygen, normally coming from the heart, oxygen is 90 millimeters mercury. And CO2 is 40 millimeters of mercury. What's millimeters of mercury? It's a unit of measure for pressure. So just telling you the partial pressure of these gases. And it's also important to note that the respiratory rate, how much we're breathing, is controlled by that CO2 partial pressure. It's not actually controlled by how much oxygen we have, but by how much CO2 we've built up in our bodies. And then, of course, you have the path of blood throughout the body. You guys have probably learned this before, but let's just go through it together. We have blue arrows signifying blood that does not have oxygen, and red signifying the blood that does have oxygen. We start at the heart, as always, and the heart has some blood that does not have oxygen. It pumps it to the lungs where it gets that oxygen, and then from the lungs it comes back to the heart, where it can then be pumped out to the rest of our body, and that blood at the rest of our body in these little capillaries, it's able to diffuse those gases into the tissues, into the cells that need that oxygen to make energy. And then once they use up the oxygen, the veins take it right back to the heart. So think of the heart as the middleman. It's just pumping blood to the lungs to get oxygen, and then out to the body, and then back to the lungs to get more oxygen, and then out to the body. And the way that the gases are transported in our blood, you guys probably know oxygen is transported on our red blood cells, on these hemoglobin molecules. So this is just basically a protein on our red blood cells, the hemoglobin is, and it can carry a heme, which is a molecule with iron in it, and oxygen loves to stick to that heme, that iron right there. So it can carry 4 oxygen molecules per hemoglobin protein, and that's on the red blood cells. Then carbon dioxide is transported in the form of bicarbonate. So it's not CO2 in the blood, it's a slightly different form with a hydrogen right here and an oxygen, just kind of some extra things to balance it out in our blood. Something that physicians use a lot are lung volumes. So I have a graph here on the left. It can be really complex to learn every single lung volume. I just want to introduce the idea to you guys. So these lung volumes are helping physicians and respiratory therapists understand how well a person's lungs are functioning. And this graph on the left shows you various lung volumes. The first that we'll take a look at is the tidal volume, or VT. This is just your regular breathing. So on the left we see this is lung volume on our y-axis. This tidal volume is just regular breathing, how much we breathe in and out normally. And then we have vital capacity, which is denoted here as IVC. And vital capacity is if you inhaled all the way that you could and then exhaled, forced out all the air that you could. That is your vital capacity. So it's a lot larger than your tidal volume because you don't normally breathe in all you can and exhale all you possibly can. However, the vital capacity that we just talked about is not the same as your entire total lung capacity, shown here as TLC. And this is because there is a residual volume, or RV, here on the graph. There's always a residual volume of air in your lungs. Your lungs are never without air. There's always that residual volume. So I want you guys to think, why do we need that residual volume? What might happen if all the air could escape from our lungs? And then here are some tools that we use to measure these lung volumes. So these are called spirometers. The spirometer on the top right is a little bit more complex. It allows us to measure a lot of the lung volumes on the previous slide. And that would include tidal volume, as well as something physicians use, which is FEV1, which means forced expiratory volume in the first second. So that's if somebody was blowing out air into the spirometer, how much air can they blow out in that first second? That tells you a lot about how well the lungs are able to act for the person. In this spirometer on the bottom right, we have an incentive spirometer. So this is a spirometer that helps people keep their lungs clear and active. It's used more in recovery from illness and surgery. So this isn't measuring any volume necessarily. It does have these numbers, and the main thing is it's not measuring specific lung volumes. It's just telling you, here's how well you're doing as you as you breathe in. So it helps you to recover from surgery or illness because you're using your lungs. And finally, we're going to talk about two types of lung disease. We've got obstructive lung disease and restrictive lung disease. So the difference is, obstructive lung disease, you have shortness of breath due to difficulty exhaling all the air from your lungs. So obstructive, difficulty exhaling. Restrictive lung disease, lung expansion is restricted, so it's harder to fill the lungs with air. Restrictive, it's hard to inhale. So on obstructive lung disease, you usually have inflammation in those bronchial tubes, in the actual airway itself. It doesn't necessarily have to do with your alveoli. So when there's inflammation in these bronchial tubes, normally they're nice and wide open, but as that inflammation increases, the swelling increases, the walls thicken, and you lose the space in those bronchioles. So it's difficult for you to exhale all the air from your lungs. And this typically happens in people with asthma or bronchitis or emphysema. With restrictive, remember, we can't inhale as well. And this has all to do with the alveoli, usually. So we have alveolar walls thickened, and there's inflammation in the alveoli. And this includes fluid and the blood cells coming to the scene of inflammation. We have less space in our alveoli, so it's harder for the lungs to fill with air in the first place. Lung expansion is restricted. And this typically occurs in people with pneumonia, pulmonary fibrosis, and pulmonary edema, among other types of lung disease.